Sankalpa Ghosh co-authored The Case for Animal-Friendly AI and is currently leading an Ethics with AI project with Oxford University and NUS. He helps lead Like a Dog and Open Telemed and is one of the organizers of the AI for Animals 2025 conference. Christoper Berry is the executive director of the Non-Human Rights Project. He leads efforts to secure legal rights for non-human animals, challenging their status as property and advocating for recognition of their fundamental rights. Let's give a warm welcome to both of them.
All right. As you saw, we're going to get this party started. So this is a topic that I've had the pleasure that Christoper and I have been developing for over a year now in regular discussions. And what we really wanted to do was bring it before everyone to start to trial these ideas and see if we can develop them together. So the question really is, what's the intersection of animal law and artificial intelligence? And our thesis and potentially our mantra is that representation is all you need. So again, what is the relationship between animals and machines, between animals and artificial intelligence? And how does that relate to the system of governance which sees and represents different types of lives within it? And there's a whole history of this. And that history, of course, is in a present state, and we all are wondering and hoping that it could be in a future state. So I greatly admire the work of my friend and collaborator in this project who runs the Non-Human Rights Project. So I'm going to introduce it over to Christoper.
Thank you, Sankalpa. I want to just spend a few minutes sort of concretizing the discussion by talking about really some case studies about what it means to represent animals in the legal system for humans. So we're going to just do a little bit of foundational education about that, and then I'll kick it over to Sankalpa to talk about animal-friendly AI, and then we'll sort of tie both of those things together and talk about how AI can actually help represent animals within the legal system. So, as has been mentioned, so I work at the Non-Human Rights Project, which is special, I think, compared to most legal advocacy for animals, and that where the mission of the organization is to secure legal rights for non-human animals. A lot of advocacy is really more around helping them in roundabout ways. But, for example, a human visitor of a zoo who sees an animal suffering, filing a lawsuit on behalf of that human to alleviate their aesthetic harm of seeing an animal suffering. And these roundabout ways of advocating for animals in the legal system, in the status quo, are really just sort of nibbling around the edges. And well, there's really two problems with that. So one is animals are having their interests discounted. They're suffering greatly in large magnitude. So there's an animal suffering problem that legal rights could help alleviate. And there's another problem as well, which is that our legal system isn't living up to its own ideals. It's not living up to its own laws in a fair and equitable way with regards to animals. So it's two different problems that we're trying to solve here through the Non-Human Rights Project. We're best known for filing habeas corpus lawsuits on behalf of animals. And this is William Blackstone. It's a Blackstone quote here from the 1700s, talking about habeas corpus and under English common law, which was really started with the Magna Carta, I think in the 13th century is when that was signed. And you can see here, just drawing out sort of the key quote, that no subject of England can be long detained in prison, except in those cases in which the law requires and justifies such detainer. So I think this is really quite interesting. As a lawyer, you're always sort of looking at the language of the words and wondering, is this being applied properly? And if you look at this, right, no subjects can be detained unless it's justified, essentially is what they're saying. So it's a right to be free from unjustified confinement. And there's nothing about this that should be, if we actually care about protecting people, their liberty from unjust confinement, it shouldn't matter what the biological sort of makeup of that individual is. And so as a lawyer, this is quite interesting and I think a compelling case to bring in front of a judge. So On the next one, this is habeas corpus has been used in a lot of ways. Originally, it was, I think the intent really was political prisoners of the King of England, right? The dukes and earls of England wanted a way to escape the king's dungeon if they were being unlawfully withheld, and so that was part of their demand with the Magna Carta. But over the years, it has been extended in a lot of ways. Lord Mansfield famously extended it to enslaved humans. Importantly, in the Somerset decision, which has a reputation of essentially having abolished human slavery in England, and today's his birthday, actually, so happy birthday, Lord Mansfield, has been used in other contexts as well, including abducted children, women who were sent to madhouses by their husbands who were just trying to get rid of them. So it's been used flexibly in a lot of cases to achieve this purpose of, preventing unjustified confinement. And let's see, importantly, these cases occurred before the Declaration of Independence. So that means that American common law inherited this writ of habeas corpus and its flexibility at the founding of the country. So the Non-Human Rights Project has been applying that to non-human animals. This is our first case was on behalf of a chimpanzee named Tommy, who was a solitary chimpanzee, essentially living in a dungeon, and arguing that this should be flexibly applied to them as well. Maybe we perhaps didn't know chimpanzees had the experience that they had. We heard about Kant and René Descartes, famous philosophers and ethicists in the Renaissance era who discounted animals, and a large part of that was because we just didn't know as much about neurobiology as we know today. So long story short, we've been doing this for about 12 years at the Non-Human Rights Project. Been unsuccessful in setting that as a precedent, but we have been making progress along the way. This is a judge from the New York Court of Appeal who initially actually had ruled against Tommy's right to habeas corpus, and then through some procedural machinations that we don't need to get into, the case ended up before him again in 2017. And while the rest of the New York Court of Appeal was dismissive of it, he wrote a concurring opinion. He thought it was properly dismissed on procedural grounds, but he said he was quite sympathetic and appeared to have had a change of heart over his earlier decisions. So that's a quote from him. Up there sympathizing with this issue. And then if we can go on to the next one. A few years later, Happy the elephant being held alone in at the Bronx Zoo in New York. Her case went up to the highest court in New York, the New York Court of Appeals. Judge Fahey had retired at that point, but in her case, again, she lost in a majority opinion, right? There's 7 judges on the New York Court of Appeal. 5 of them ruled against her, essentially just saying because she's not a human, like that's the end, which, in my view is just like a per se prejudice. But there were 2 justices, Wilson, who's now the Chief Justice of the New York Court of Appeal, and Justice Rivera, or Judge Rivera, who wrote in her favor. And this is a quote from Judge Wilson. Encourage people to look into those dissents more. They're very beautiful, very powerful, and I think will only age better and better over time. Just a couple takeaways here. So this is just a really like a snapshot of the work of the Non-Human Rights Project, but we don't need to belabor it. The key takeaways is that rather than suing on behalf of a zoo visitor, we're suing really in the interest of the animal themselves, right? Like we're saying that this animal has a right, this non-human animal has a right not to be unjustly confined. And so that's an important takeaway because it'll tie into our question about representation in a minute here. And I'll just make one other note as well that, habeas corpus and a right to bodily liberty is one example of a legal. It's not necessarily the only example of a legal right. So just because this is, I'll say for illustrative purposes, but field of animal legal rights potentially could be much more expanded than so. I'll hand it over to Sankalpa to talk about animal-friendly AI.
Thank you, Christopher. And I think what Christopher is doing is at the very cutting edge, right? And that everyone in this room is actually doing that. And so let's see where we can push it. We have a ever increasingly technological society, and we argue that we have a techno-scientific society, and that we say that science can use this technology so that we can know more about our place in the world, and our relationship with one another. It's worth understanding that these two elements that we're discussing here, animals and machines, sort of biology and technology, have always been at the center of our model of the world, even as those models update our machines, and by so doing, update our own lives as animals. So this paper, as people may know, is the one that introduced the modern method by which all LLMs work. As I said, transformatively, attention is all you need. So what we're proposing is that we're going to be paying attention in new ways at the intersection of animals and machine, and we should really pay attention to representation. And so this is a paper that I wrote with some fellow philosopher and engineer collaborators called The Case for Animal-Friendly AI, and it's not the ethics of AI, fairness, safety, all those things are very important. Ethics with AI, saying there are problems we have, and in our field, maybe we can do a little better in those problems and understanding the structure of those problems and trying to solve them with these tools. As everyone knows in chemistry, you can do a little bit better with AI systems, right? If you have AlphaFold. And so as philosophers, we're trying to explore this domain and say, what are our problems and how do we do it? And a central problem with regard to animals is, how do we know how to do right by their interests and preferences? How do we know what they want? How do we represent them in our society in ways that are for them? And so this paper introduced an approach to saying, can we use AI to model animal consideration, including from the perspective of the animals themselves? So what we did is we introduced two concepts: quantified empathy and artificial representation. Quantified empathy is the suggestion that you can take a term like empathy and you can evaluate it from minimum to maximum, 0 to 100, and you can sort of say, how close am I to being in your shoes when I am making a decision about you? Am I in your perspective? Well, that's 100. And I thought about you when we had lunch together, and I made sure that it worked out according to the ways of the things that you would like to have lunch. And 0 is me definitely making the worst lunch ever, or something even worse, right? And so that's kind of what we said is, let's quantify this qualitative aspect. And this has nothing to do with AI. This is just trying to be more precise about language. But it's introducing a model that you could ask yourself if you saw a scenario, or think of someone treating you in a particular way, and you're sort of, that was the best thing they could have ever done for me. Happy birthday, 100. And you can say other situations. What would it be? And can you yourself make a guess? Can you have many people make those guesses? Can we sort of start to say this? And then the second idea is that if we can do that and we can implement that calculator in artificial intelligence systems, could it be part of a model of artificial representation where we can say, we want to represent your perspective and we're going to use this artificial agent to help do so? And we think that that is plausible to at least investigate and potentially to execute. So this is simple. There's you can do it yourself. You can run this prompt right now, and you can say, you as an AI are going to operate in this way. And then you can start asking it questions. In our earlier talk, Cass Sunstein had sort of talked a little bit about that. What would a choice engine for artificial intelligence be that could help you understand what your dog is feeling when you're going to the veterinary doctor in a way that's in your dog's interests? And so we ran this, but again, you can see we are trying to move this towards computation. And so again, you can see we kind of made a formal definition. The most animal-friendly thing you could possibly do is do it from the perspective of the animal. And then we started to say, let's run a bunch of other perspectives and see how they score. And we built an AI infrastructure that let us run this basically on about 13,000 different scenarios involving animals. Everything from what would you like to do if you're being taken out today for a walk, to, here are slaughterhouse scenarios, or here are other types of things. And then we said, now that we know this is the question and the scenario is how it'll develop, let's judge that from your own perspective as that. And this actually philosophically relates to a really central question. Thomas Nagel wrote in the 80s a paper called "What is it like to be a bat?" and sort of questioned, can we know what it's like? And what we're suggesting is that maybe we can try to simulate and gather some data to fill this data availability gap. And so, again, this is empathy. It's about taking on the perspective of others. And we're arguing that artificial intelligence, because it's a machine mirror, and because it's a language machine, and because language allows us to do imaginative projection, can generate some results, and we can try to see if those results can be accurate or calibrated towards accuracy. And so, and then if those can be used. So again, we built this infrastructure and ran a bunch of scenarios. And so what it really brings up is what I said before, which is how do we do better? And what we're trying to do better at, and this is what I would define animal-friendly AI as a project, is how well do our systems represent animals' own interests, and can we do a little better? And it's a really large solution space or problem space. There's lots of things we can try to do better at. So this is not just cutting edge, this is really foundationally grounded. This is a quote from 1651 from Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, which is central text in the formulation of our system of government and representative government and social contract. And what it basically says is there are natural persons and there are artificial persons. And natural persons are you and I and all of us, and artificial persons are those who represent us and our interests as moved through the system. So your banker, your lawyer, your government representative. So this idea of artificial representation for natural persons is at the center of the liberal idea of society. And what we're asking is, how does this moment and the technologies we have allow us to potentially consider that more? And could AI in particular, and legal AI, help represent an animal's own perspective in situations where it matters? So having said that, I'll pass it back to Christoper to talk about some of the very specific things that this thesis may let us approach. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll say one more thing. So if that's all kind of foundational, is that an interesting way of thinking about it? Everyone at this conference is working on aspects of this. And this is just a paper from last week. Actually, Peter Singer sent me this. And what it shows is that a machine learning algorithm was developed which reports 90% accuracy in decoding and essentially representing the emotional valence, how good or bad is this feeling right now, of ungulates and donkeys, horses, a variety of other creatures. And so again, we're starting to be at the place where we might be able to gather this information, and it might set us up for what I'll pass over to Christoper.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think this has been a very interesting and, I don't know, like fun collaboration, because we both have come from different backgrounds. Because if you're trying to think about like what are ways that AI can interface with the legal system, it really helps to have an AI background, right? Someone who could actually program AI and understands the technical stuff, and then to also have like a legal background. So in my view, it's almost necessarily sort of a collaborative effort. So I think it's a very like interesting collaboration, and I think this right here is kind of the heart of the matter, which is how artificial intelligence could plug in, and ways in which it can help augment human advocates for animals in the legal system to do better than they could do right now, and maybe perhaps for the artificial intelligence to even do on its own do better than the human advocate could. So this is just really framework for that. And hopefully, yeah, maybe you can interrupt me or whatever.
and thanks everyone for letting us set this up. So we'll show you a couple of areas where we think that this can be applied in the law if you had an artificial intelligence that was a representative of the animal. So
the first one would be artificial intelligence as a client or a proxy for the client. And what I mean by that is considering the animal to be the client, right? So normally you would think the client is the partner in a marriage who's getting divorced goes to the attorney, and that's the client. But when we're talking about animals themselves having the legal rights and then actually representing them in the legal system, in that situation, really we should be thinking about the animal as the client. And here's a model rule of professional conduct, because attorneys, like other professionals, are subject to regulations to ensure sort of ethical conduct. And the highlighted part really is kind of the heart of this matter, which is that the lawyer shall, for an incapacitated or a client with diminished capacity who can't say, I want you to file this lawsuit on my behalf, or I want you to accept that settlement, or I want you to press ahead and reject the settlement. For a situation like this, the lawyer shall, as far as reasonably possible, maintain a normal client relationship with the client. And so if artificial intelligence is acting as a proxy for the client, it could be that can inform help to inform what the client's interests are in the matter. Currently, we would do that by talking to experts and people who know the individual animal to ask them about it. But this is an opportunity, I think, for artificial intelligence to help augment that, or maybe even directly observe the individual and sort of translate them, say, oh, this is how much they're suffering in this situation, and how valuable, how much, yes, they would want to go to a sanctuary instead of being in the substandard roadside zoo. And courts have called into question, one way of dealing with some of these cases is to call that into question. I think for the most part in very odd and unreasonable ways. Anyone who listened to Raj's talk yesterday, he talked about an Oregon Intermediate Court of Appeal asked, how do we know that this horse would want $100,000 to cover his necessary medical expenses? Which feels quite absurd to me, but there could be situations, right? Imagine a very elderly animal, right, where you would question, is this going to be stressful for them? So I think there could certainly be some rules for that. Or elephants, for example, are known to be altruistic. So if there were a settlement to end a case that looked like it was actually going to set good precedent, probably as the attorney, I would just err on the side of caution and give the elephant sanctuary and let the case get dismissed. But it's possible that maybe the elephant would prefer to sort of sacrifice their own interest for the interest of members of their community. I don't know. So it could help parse those answers. And I will say that one area I wanted to get into that cuts into, there's a few other roles here, but is about like how much we trust the AI to actually do that, right? Like, are we going to say, maybe it's inappropriate at this point to even consult AI about those questions? That's probably around where we're at right now. But at some point, maybe it's like, well, it's good enough that you can or you should consult it. And at some point, I could envision rules of professional conduct where the court is actually, or the rules committees are saying, we want you to consult with AI because it actually seems to be so good at representing and conveying the interest of human or non-human clients with diminished capacity. That's as a client proxy. Sankalpa, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
And just to be mindful of our time and everyone, should we just run through the different things and just open it up? So here's expert witness, and we can just tell everyone what's kind of the 4 setups, and then we can turn it over.
Cool. For expert witnesses, if you want to go there, just like giving a little crash course in the law, try to keep it at what I call a kindergartner level, which I think is actually the right level, even to talking to lawyers and judges. But so expert witnesses are people you can call to the stand that can help sort of, is this cruel because it caused unjustified suffering? What is the liberty interest of this, gorilla on whose behalf you're filing a habeas corpus lawsuit as a hypothetical? And the highlighted parts there, like the judge will only admit that expert testimony if it's reliable, right? So that's sort of the key there. How reliable is it? Is this actually helpful?
Now I'll just move on to the next one.
AI is a special master. That's actually really similar to the expert witness, but there's this role in litigation called a special master, where courts, rather than having an expert witness helping a party prove the case, the court might say, this is really complicated. I want a special master to help the court analyze and sort through these issues. Famously, I think the most famous example of this in the non-human animal context was the Vic dogfighting bust where there were 50 plus dogs, I think, that got rescued. And the question is, what do we do with them? Like, can they actually be rehabilitated and rehomed or not? And the judge didn't know what to do, so appointed a special master to do individual assessments with each dog to determine what the best course was for each individual. As attorney or judge, this is a little more far-fetched, but you could imagine AI playing sort of various roles here. Maybe as like a paralegal, it's helping with some of the kind of the back-end stuff, maybe drafting documents, maybe even at some point signing documents or completely supplanting the lawyers. I know there's some startups around parking tickets, having AI help with parking tickets, right? So that So sort of along lines there, and maybe even the judge someday. To me, it seems like almost unfathomable that the legal profession would ever allow AI to supplant lawyers and judges. In part because we have a self-interest not to allow that to happen, because then our law degrees go to waste. But I think it's quite possible, and we should at least be open to the idea that someday AI might be better than lawyers and judges at sorting this stuff out.
Great.
And then the last one, sorry, just kind of running through these. As a quasi-legal advocate, so there's situations that are not in the courtroom, and I actually want to highlight this for people in particular, because I think this might actually be the most immediate way of sort of deploying this, but asking for public records, analyzing public records, doing public record appeals. Agencies will do regulations. If you were around for Cass Sunstein's talk, he was talking about agency regulations. They'll have to open it up for like what's called notice and comment. So like just detecting what is open for notice and comment and like what should we say about it. You could have AI doing this. You could have AI looking for legal violations and like sort of generating letters to compile the evidence and the law and send that to law enforcement and say, hey, go check this out and do something about it. So I think there's some opportunity there, and an advantage to that is it doesn't require a judge to say the AI is allowed to do something. You could just do it, generally speaking, I think, without having some kind of permission. So.
Great, thank you. So we'll just close it there and see if we can open up to questions, or if there aren't questions, we'll take it ourselves. But we're trying to explore this, and we invite people to pursue it too.
So I want to talk about the use case of using AI as like an advocate for animals, not in the legal sense, but just in the sense of here's what they actually mean. I would argue that we don't need AI in this context of legal cases, because all the AI really does, and also with the article you shared of like being able to distinguish positive and negative emotional states, it really relies on the opinions or the labeling of human experts, and then just kind of scales that up, which is what AI is usually good for, taking what, if you look at human domain experts, then scaling up that expertise and making it a lot more available. But in the majority of cases, AI isn't better than a good human that is skilled at that specific task. And since with legal cases, you're usually talking about a handful of cases a year, I assume, it seems like what you need is not necessarily scale, and that it would be more effective to actually hire humans that are like experts in, well, if we're talking about the case of justice, then horse behavior and communication, or any other animal, and use their expert witness opinion.
Well, I think there's maybe two. I just sort of have two responses. One, I think it's a good point, right? Like if maybe the humans are good enough. There was one story I wanted to share, like that I didn't get to, but back when I was working at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, I had a case involving farrowing crates and whether those were cruel or not. California law without any farmed animal exemption says it's anyone who confines an animal shall provide it with an adequate exercise area. So the argument was like, well, that the farrowing crate doesn't seem to be an adequate exercise area. And I, had reached out to a veterinary expert at a agricultural school who was like, I agree with you, but the chair of my department would kill me because we would lose a bunch of grants and like relationships if I went against the agriculture industry, because that's where most of our work and money comes from. And so I got referred to someone else, and they said the exact same thing. And then it happened again, and it happened in actually a few agricultural cases that I did. And the takeaway was that there's a systemic problem, right? Where particularly for this field, the veterinary field, where they're so beholden and get so much money from the industry that it was basically like a career suicide to ally with an animal group, even if the expert agreed with us. So in situations like that, artificial intelligence, I think, could be quite helpful. And then just another quick point is, I've been doing animal cases for 15 years, and I have yet for an animal to actually pay an invoice that we've sent them. So there's quite a resource gap there. A lot of times the opponents, when an argument against rights for animals or like expanded standing for animal cases, is that they'll say, well, there's just going to be a ton of cases that get filed. And I'm worried about exactly the opposite, which is that only the most attractive, most egregious cases are the ones that are going to attract pro bono legal attention, and that tons of cases that are meritorious, that deserve scrutiny, are not. So
Just to build on top of that, I think there's first and foremost just this technical question. It's kind of a sweet question, right? Can we do this, right? Can you accurately represent someone? And then a lawyer's job is to try to do that and put it into places. So I think there's, can we do this? If we could do it, how could it empower different approaches? And one could imagine a world where there, as Christopher was saying, a lot more cases brought forth that are trying to advance the interests of individual animals.
But wouldn't the bottleneck here be the lawyers more than the... I would think that the bottleneck here would be lawyers that are willing to work for animals that are not going to pay the invoice, and not necessarily just the human experts that would say, yes, I can tell by the way this horse is acting that they're actually distressed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is back to, I don't know if you were hearing Cass's talk, but his argument was, let's start an NAACP for AI for animals that can help make small victories and then big victories. He was talking about how he clerked for Thurgood Marshall and how that was a movement that in 20 years, from the 30s to the 50s, 60s, 30 years, won, right? And so I think the question for all of us is just, what does it look like to win, right? What has animal liberation accomplished, right? So I think everyone here is doing incredible work. We want to do this, and our hope should be that these systems empower us. So I totally take what you're saying, but I think I would hope that we can give you some tools that would make your job easier to represent your clients. And then we can start to think about what the law firms are, the law practices are, the legislation that enables it, the wins we can get across the world. And I don't know, win one day.
Just to play devil's advocate, we already have a ton of research that shows animal capacity, suffering, emotions, etc. Do you think that using AI to reflect that in the law will actually be helpful, or do you think that we're not ready for that at all, and we're still going to be waiting another 20 years for the law to catch up?
So you said we already have a lot of research.
We do, in terms of the capacity for animals to suffer, to reflect that they need a life for flourishing, etc. We have that research already.
There was a mention in the last session of Martha Nussbaum's book, Justice for Animals, which applies the capabilities approach developed by her and Amartya Sen, extending it beyond development, economics, and human welfare to all human and non-human animals. And what is basically the takeaway message, at least for me, out of that book is we want to make lists of capabilities of what it means to be flourishing, okay? And what it means to be flourishing is different, of course, if you have wings or if you have fins or if you are of various forms. And so the technical term here might be what are called ethographs. So there, Joyce Poole, who's an elephant expert, has literally built what's called the elephant ethograph. You can look it up, and it's this massive documentation of various behaviors and what are preferred ones. So she basically says, let's start building up more and more ethographs. To some degree, we know a lot about the animals that we've experimentally tested on. Probably the best ethograph in the world is on mice and rats, and then all the way across. So I think that if you can do that and you can start to create indexes of ethographs that connect to what is good and bad, and then you can also have that, again, as I think Professor Sunstein in the last talk said, one of the main things that's a value of AI is it could help you see and be a witness and do that. So I think some of the trajectories ahead are that we, again, would hope when a mouse is not feeling comfortable, and that is sort of indisputable, because you now start to have not just people saying it and doing that, but starting to have instruments of measurement and hopefully plugging that into it, it could just sort of say, that's what flourishing looks like. And so that would be the aim, if that makes sense.
Let me just add too, all this on the point about that we already have a lot of information. So what gives is I feel very frustrated with our justice system that we do have this information available, that we do have laws that have existed for 800 years that say you can't unjustly confine, hurt somebody's interest in their own liberty. And, clearly there are some animals being confined that do have an interest in their liberties, and the law is just, in a way, in my view, just gaslighting everybody by saying that there's no liberty interest to be seen here. So I do think a lot of this is behavioral on behalf and psychological on behalf of the judges, or kind of like cultural forces that need to be unwound. And so a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is probably ahead of its time, I would hazard to say, both
Talking
in
about
regards
it
to
now.
the technology of the artificial intelligence, but also where the legal system is at right now. So,
I think we can close up unless anyone has a last question, and Rachel will let us get it asked. Thank you.
For the paper you mentioned earlier, where it was like 90%, you're able to see the valence state of an animal. What is the validation, or what are the labels on the emotional states of these animals?
I think that connects, great question, and I think that connects the previous two questions exactly, which is we have, unfortunately, or fortunately, a lot of data on what we think from a veterinary perspective, from an ethological perspective, what our range is on it. Now, maybe we don't know everything. My wife is a veterinary doctor, and one of the things she talks about is sort of presentation of pain is a big question when you don't have vocalizations the way you and I can tell. And for whatever it's worth, that's what Wittgenstein talked about, is that it's what's your internal state and all that. So I think that it is referring to this external one. One could imagine a future where in some sort of observation state, this is a lot of emotive AI. You might have seen that. Reads your face and says, hey, are you in frustration or anger or joy? So you could imagine more and more of those kind of things. But the present validation is basically cross-reference with our scales and indexes of it. Thank you, everyone, for giving us a chance to present these ideas to you. And like we said, representation is all you need.